Welcome, folks. You're listening to the A Minute to Midnight Show. This is Tony. Today on the show we have well-known author Bill Salus for the first time on our show, and we'll be discussing the Middle East and what's going on and how does it play in with Bible prophecy. It's a fascinating interview, and I certainly learned quite a bit from Bill, and I'm sure you will as well. We welcome Bill Salus to the A Minute to Midnight Show. It's the first time we've had you on the show, Bill, and I'm honoured to have you on today.
Thank you, Tony. It's great to be on your show. I'm looking forward to the topics you told me you'd like to discuss. Very powerful stuff about the Middle East.
Yeah, well, it's such a pertinent subject. We see so much going on there, and every day there's new developments. I mean, even today I saw an article about, is Baghdadi from ISIS dead or is he alive? That these things that just don't die, these kind of subjects. So I'm sure the listeners will largely be familiar with you and your work already, but for those that aren't, perhaps you could give them a bit of a background into your ministry. Sure.
Bill Salus is my name, as you said, and we have a website called prophecydepot.com. Over here in the States, Depot, like Home Depot. I don't know if you've got Home Depots over there where you're at, Tony, but I kind of use that as a reference. And we deal primarily with Bible prophecies, lots of articles and media outlets. I'm a media personality as well. And the goal with our ministry is to take the complex prophetic information that's about a third of the Bible and simplify it, discern it appropriately, and simplify it so that it can be understood by everybody. It's not just for the scholarly. And we like to do it in a way where people understand, listen, there's a secular worldview, but there's a biblical narrative and a prophetic perspective that we all need to be putting side by side here. It's okay to know the secular worldview, but don't limit yourself there. Understand what the Bible has to say about these events. So that's the nature of our ministry. That's sort of our mission statement.
That sounds great. So, okay, today I think if we want to look at Psalm 83 and Ezekiel 38 and 39 as how they relate to perhaps the world today and particularly the Middle East, perhaps you want to outline what you have written even on those subjects.
Yes, absolutely. These are two major prophecies in the Bible that have yet to find fulfillment. Ezekiel 38 is probably the more popularized one. It is a very powerful prophecy. You've got Ezekiel 38 carries over into Ezekiel 39. You've got 52 verses in those two chapters, very descriptive. It talks about an invasion that's going to come against Israel in the latter days when the Jews are regathered out of the nations back into the land. Russia's going to spearhead. Most of us believe the participants in this coalition is spearheaded by Russia, would include Turkey, Iran, some of the North African countries like Libya, perhaps, going over toward the east of Africa, Sudan and Somalia, some of the breakaway republics of the Soviet Union, some of the stands, the Kazakhstans and Tajikistan's, et cetera. And, we try to put a face on identity on these countries. But when Ezekiel wrote, these places didn't exist per se. There was Meshech and Tubal and Togarmah, and so that was the vocabulary of his time. So the job of the prophecy teachers is to try to, figure out who he would be talking about in the application of today on today's maps. And they're going to come against Israel. It's going to be the most massive, armed, and dangerous Mideast invasion of all times up to that point. And we think the stage is being set rapidly for this prophecy. And they're going to come into Israel to invade. For plunder and booty, it says. They want to deprive Israel of their great prosperity or livelihood that they would have when this prophecy finds fulfillment. And of course, Israel now is becoming a very robust economy. They've discovered natural gas finds in 2009, 2010 that will make it energy independent and also an energy exporter when they develop these natural gas finds. They're discovering shale oil, so there will be a very wealthy Israel. Is that wealthy Israel in place right now? Is that going to be substantial enough, the Israel we see today, for Russia to put this formidable coalition to come against Israel for that purpose? Or are there other things that have to set the stage for that? And so I get it when I write about these topics. I've written about both these topics in my book called Psalm 83, The Missing Prophecy Revealed. I sequenced Psalm 83, which is a different set of details, and Ezekiel 38. I put Psalm 83 first. It sets the stage for Ezekiel 38. Psalm 83 involves different populations. The list of countries I mentioned in Ezekiel 38, none of them share common borders with Israel, and none of them have ever been Israel's notorious enemies from the past. Whereas Psalm 83 has another grouping of, there's 10 populations listed there by Asaph, who wrote at the time of King David about 3,000 years ago. We find out he's actually a prophet, not only a worship leader of King David, but a prophet in 2 Chronicles 29:30. So he takes a whole other group with another purpose, but it's a confederacy. These are the countries that share common borders with Israel. At the time Asaph wrote, he was talking about Edomites and Ammonites and Moabites, and sometimes they joke around and saying gigabytes and termites too, and but so people don't understand who they are. So we have maps in the book and stuff, and basically this is the countries that share common borders with Israel. I call them an inner circle. They would be Lebanon to the north, that of course Hezbollah is there, Syria to the northeast, Iraq, Jordan to the direct east of Israel, Saudi Arabia, Egypt. You got the Palestinians are a key player in this, I believe. References the Edomites in the prophecy. You've got Hamas is over there in the Gaza. Of course, now you got to throw ISIS in. You were talking about the article about Baghdadi, the leader of ISIS. So, this is sort of the two major events. And so when we're watching on the mainstream media, the news, it's like, Syria's got this revolution going on. Baghdadi's not dead. Iran's trying to get a nuclear program. Russia's got its footprint now in the Middle East. Trump is 59 Tomahawk missiles into Syria, about a month ago. And they're getting all this news, but the bottom line is, there's actually all these people are mentioned in predictions in the Bible in Psalm 83 and Ezekiel 38. So this is what's important. People need to understand that we don't have to take a guess at what the future holds, because the Bible is quite clear about the future fates of these various countries.
I hear a lot of people say, Israel, the state of Israel is not Israel of the Bible, and that, they're not real Jews and they're Khazars and all sorts of, every other theory under the sun that tries to slam Israel as the source of all the problems, and that it shouldn't exist and all that. But to me, you've only got to look at Ezekiel 37 to 39, and you couldn't have that scenario without there being an Israel like we see today. So to me, it's like one of the strongest arguments that this, not that Israel's a perfect state, and I believe there's a lot that's gone into the making of Israel that isn't right, like Rothschild influence and etc. But the point of the matter is, people throw the baby out with the bathwater, because you couldn't have these chapters in Ezekiel without there being an Israel. And to me, it's one of the strongest passages in the whole Bible that show us where we are at today. So I'm actually interested to know. I know people have different ideas about who the players in the second war, the Ezekiel 38, 39, Gog and Magog. Why do you come up with Russia as being the spearhead?
Well, this is commonly taught among most of today's top scholars, and even back among the people throughout history that looked at this prophecy. And Gog of Magog is Gog is, matter of fact, let me just go to Ezekiel 38 and read a couple verses so that they understand who these participants are, because they're right in the very beginning, first 5 verses of Ezekiel 38. And it says, the word of the Lord came to Ezekiel, and he says, set your face against Gog of the land of Magog, the prince of Rosh, Meshech, and Tubal. And he goes on, talks about other groups there, and you got Persia in there and Ethiopia and stuff like that. So what he's saying is he's speaking to Gog, who would be like a leader. He would be like a czar or a kaiser, or the president per se. And so then we have to determine, well, who's the leader that he's addressing? And he's from the land of Magog. And so we look at some of the historical writings trying to find out, well, where's Magog? We've got other details in the prophecy. It says that this invasion comes to the uttermost parts of north, which you beeline a line directly from Israel. You got up to Moscow. Rosh and Magog, it's commonly taught that the Scythians went through the tribe. Josephus tells us this is secular, the Jewish historian back the time of the Roman Empire. And so we find connections with him and other historical writers. So most people have come up with the determination that it's involving Russia. There are some new theories positing that it could be Turkey. Turkey's clearly in the prophecy under Meshech and Tubal and some other names. But Gog of Magog appears to be the leader of Russia. That's what I adhere to, and many of my colleagues believe that. So, and this Gog, he puts together this coalition, and it says in Ezekiel 38, verse 10, that it comes to pass that evil thoughts arise in his mind. And it goes in and says he's going to come and against the land of unwalled villages. He's referring to Israel, a peaceful people that dwell safely without walls, having neither bars nor gates, to take the plunder and booty, which I talked about, the livelihood, and that sort of thing. So we get these descriptions of who the participants are in the first 5 verses. Then we get the scenario where he's going to come and invade. We get the details of what Israel looks like at the time of the invasion, and we find out the motive is he's coming for their prosperity, their national livelihood, plunder and booty. Now, the reason I shift the focus of the listeners to not only this prophecy but also Psalm 83 is because the Israel that Ezekiel is describing says that the Jews are being brought back out of the nations of the world into the land of Israel in the latter days. And, it's not too difficult to get a lot of the listeners to understand, hey, these really could be the latter days. Israel became a nation in 1948. That very well could be, as many of us teach, when the world hourglass made its final spin, and now the grains of sand are going down into the lower chamber, and we are getting deep into the end times, and all the biblical prophecies are starting to converge, even this one, which is another indicator that, hey, we are living in the latter days. Well, this prophecy requires that there be in Israel, and it exists in the latter days, 2 ingredients that Ezekiel mentions. We seem to have those on the table right now. And it says that they're being gathered out of the nations, which is still going on. Jews are still coming out of the nations into a land which had long been desolate. And, presently it's not, but it was. Even when Mark Twain, the literary giant of America, one of the most respected authors we've got in America historically, he went over to the Middle East when it was called Palestine in 1867, traveled up through Palestine. Now, of course, it's called Israel. He went up to Lebanon and Syria. And he comes back and writes in his book after his visit to the Middle East area in 1869, and he talks about this desolate wasteland that's actually, in Ezekiel 38 here. I mean, he uses terms like, even, the so barren animals that would love to go to I don't have his exact quote, but, animals that would, even animals were hard to find there. You couldn't even find a sojourner or someone passing through. So the point being is that the Israel of that time is not the Israel of today, because it's being rebuilt, the cities are being re-inhabited, and the ruins are being rebuilt. And so, that was an ingredient for this prophecy to find fulfillment. But Ezekiel goes on to say that they have to be dwelling securely in the midst of the land without walls, bars, nor gates. And so I contend that they're not dwelling securely because they can't dwell securely because they've got these Arabs in Psalm 83 that threaten them. They've warred against them in 1948, 1967, 1973. The reason they have walls in Israel is because they've got their neighbors, the Palestinian terrorism, of course. They got a 403-mile wall, partition wall in Israel that separates Palestinian terror out of Israel proper. So I suggest that as close as we see this prophecy setting up, it's not quite ready to find fulfillment yet until Israel deals with its neighbors who happen to be in Psalm 83.
I think, a lot of people have just viewed Psalm 83, well, not as a prophetic book until you brought this out. That was the first I'd heard of that a while ago. And it's like, okay, that does make sense. Why, though, do you think that it's not been viewed necessarily as a prophecy before, and who are the players in that?
Right. Well, it wasn't treated as a prophecy for many years because it is also what they call an imprecatory prayer, which is a prayer of lament against, the general teaching throughout the ages was that it's dealing with Asaph, the psalmist, petitioning the Lord to deal with Israel's enemies, so that Israel can be preserved and protected. And that was sort of the general teaching throughout time. But when you take a closer look at it, and you realize that Asaph, who wrote it, is a prophet. 2 Chronicles 29:30 says he's a seer, a beholder of vision, literally a prophet. He wrote 12 Psalms, Psalms 73 through 83, I believe it is, and Psalm 50. And Psalm 83 is his most prophetic. And he gives us some very specific details it says a group of people are going to come together. They're going to form a devious plan. They're going to come against Israel. They're going to try to destroy Israel, cut the nation off, that the name of Israel be remembered no more. And then it says that they are forming a confederacy against God, and with that purpose. And it tells us who they are, gives us a very specific group, which has to be a list of contemporaries, not chronological ordering of Israel's enemies, but actually a group of contemporary countries. We mentioned who they were earlier in the show. And they have a mandate which is different than Ezekiel 38, which Ezekiel 38 we talked about, they want to come for plunder and booty. Their goal in Psalm 83 verse 12 is they want to take for themselves the pastures of God for their possession. So what appears to be the case here is that it's a prophecy for our time. The Arabs are really not looking for a two-state solution between the Palestinians and the Jews. They're looking for a one-state solution, that is no Israel, but yes on Palestine. They want the Arabs, Palestinians, to have the whole land. And so I believe that's really what we're looking at here, and I believe it's relative to this prophecy. There's terms inside of the prophecy that talk about the participants. It says there'll be the tents of Edom will be among them. Tents of biblically refers to refugee scenarios. So we got a specific habitation condition listed here. It talks about Assyria will help. There'll be a strong shoulder of support for the children of Lot. So Assyria will help Jordan. We've got very specific details in here, a very specific purpose, a very specific confederacy, very specific motive. I think it is important that we look at it as a prophecy written by a prophet, more than just an imprecatory prayer of lament.
Yeah, okay, that's a good point. Very interesting. So how do you see that playing out today as you're looking at the news? Does this actually look more like what will happen? Because Iran's not in that group, where many people would say it looks like Iran could be the protagonist that hits Israel first, which would kind of then not be in line with that.
Yeah, it's interesting because Iran is the elephant in the room in the Middle East. Israel's greatest concern is Iran and that nuclear program. They've been very concerned about Iran going back to the time of even George W. Bush. I remember Benjamin Netanyahu was warning George W. Bush, President of America, to watch out for Iran and their nuclear program. They pose an existential threat to Israel. So, yeah, and Iran is not listed in Psalm 83. They're listed in Ezekiel 38. They're also listed in Jeremiah 49. Iran is under the banner of Elam, E-L-A-M. And so Iran's actually in two Bible prophecies of the end times. Both of the prophecies, Ezekiel 38 with Persia and Jeremiah 49 with Elam, are specifically end times prophecies. They both use the term in the latter days. So Iran finds itself in a double jeopardy of prophecies, and they're not in Psalm 83. Something will happen to Iran, and I believe Jeremiah 49, I've got a book written about that whole prophecy called Nuclear Showdown in Iran, revealing the ancient prophecy of Elam, E-L-A-M. I believe that is a prophecy that could happen at the present time, that it says it'll be struck, there'll be a major disaster, it'll be very problematic, but it won't wipe all of Iran out because Iran still finds itself in Ezekiel 38. But again, how these things will happen, if I were to take a guess, I would say probably the Jeremiah prophecy of Elam would happen first. This would probably, and again, to your listeners, this is speculation and conjecture on my part, but as I study the details of these prophecies, I find it fascinating. Your listeners may be interested. Well, how could these things lay out? But of course, not putting too much accountability on it, because we don't necessarily know the exact sequence. It's not like the Bible says this will happen and then that will happen, and sometimes those details are pretty specific. But we have to be a little careful. One thing we say might happen might actually succeed another event that we thought we had them out of the right placement. So with that caveat, Tony, I believe that the details of Jeremiah 49. There'll be a disaster that hits the area by the Persian Gulf. The westernmost border that tugs the Persian Gulf is where Elam is territorially. When you look at a modern-day map of Iran, you have Persia, which is about 4/5 of Iran, of Iran, mainly the central and northern parts of Iran. But Elam is the western side hugging the Persian Gulf. And severe disaster hits the area. Sounds like from the details it's nuclear. I believe then, because Iran's got a stronghold on Syria and Hezbollah, those are proxies pretty much of Iran today, even the Houthis down in Yemen. I believe that Iran will respond, and Syria will get involved in some conflict with Israel. Israel will take out Damascus. And that's a prophecy in Isaiah 17. It says that Damascus will cease from being a city. It will be a ruinous heap. And in Isaiah 17, verse 9, it says the desolation is caused by the children of Israel. So it looks like the Israeli Defense Forces would respond and take out Damascus. Now, I think then that probably leads into the final Arab offensive against Israel in Psalm 83. And, and then once that happens, Israel's beat Psalm 83, because I point out in my book, Psalm 83 book, that the Israeli Defense Forces stopped the Psalm 83 war. Then I believe that sets the stage for Israel to dwell securely and for Russia to put its coalition together on the heels of that. Turkey and Iran, of course, are Islamic. They're going to be very upset with Israel that after they conquer over the Arab Islamic countries around them in Psalm 83. So, these are things that I believe are all bona fide, legitimate prophecies. I believe that's how they could sequence. Every one of these, if your listeners are paying attention, will change their lives because these are globally impacting events. The Strait of Hormuz will probably be shut down. A third of the world's oil will be restricted. Stock markets will tumble as the Middle East conflicts grow out of control. So on and so forth.
It was interesting. I was going to ask you, when you mentioned Damascus becoming a ruinous heap, I was going to say, well, why do you think it's Israel? But then you mentioned a verse there that ties that, because I've always sort of thought, well, I hadn't actually thought of how it arrives at it necessarily being Israel. And then at the moment, because of Russia and all the other different players in there, it's hard to see that how Israel could do that because, well, everybody's in Syria at the moment. Everyone's got a stake in there, and it's hard to know exactly what's going on, really.
Well, yeah, and it's interesting you would say that. It's such a convoluted mess in Syria right now. Russia's supporting Bashar al-Assad and Iran supporting Bashar al-Assad, the president of Syria. Yet America's supporting the Free Syrian Army. Russia's trying to destroy the Free Syrian Army. America doesn't like Bashar al-Assad. All of the above are trying to stop ISIS. So it's you just don't know which dog to pick in that fight. So I understand what you're saying, and the thoughts would be, well, Israel's made it a purpose to not want to be involved in that Syrian revolution, which has been going on since 2011. However, they have been clear. Israel has been clear that they will not tolerate being drawn into, with missiles flying into Israel or being drawn into that war. And so repeatedly they've struck. They've struck well over a dozen times into Syria during this revolution. And they've tried to stop the flow of weapons going from Iran through Syria into Hezbollah. They have tried to stop missiles that have flown into the Golan Heights, supposedly indiscriminately during that war. And Israel has retaliated. They struck there was Syrian chemical weapons used by Syria. They've struck that area. There was a Al-Kibar nuclear site they struck that. I think that was in 2007. That was before the revolution. I don't have the date right. Israel's been striking Syria, and you only have to Google search that, and you'll see Israel striking Syria. They're not afraid to strike Syria, and they've threatened it. There's been rhetoric back and forth between Bashar al-Assad, how if you strike Syria, we'll take it serious and we'll strike Tel Aviv. And then Avigdor Lieberman, who's the defense minister of Israel, he said in the past, even before he was the defense minister, you strike Tel Aviv, we'll take out Damascus. So, I know that when we look at geopolitical events, you think, well, gee, the stage may not be exactly set for this to happen, but everything changes really quick over there. We woke up and one morning in the Arab Spring was going on. No one saw that coming. Even just recently, you had a couple police officers, I believe, was shot in the old city by some Palestinian terrorists, and Israel shut down the Temple Mount. And immediately there was protests going throughout Jordan saying, we want to rip up our peace treaty with Israel. You can't shut down the Temple Mount. And then the Waqf, W-A-Q-F, who's got control over the Temple Mount, says it's only for the Muslims. So, everybody's thinking, well, Jordan and Israel are at peace. They got this peace treaty, and yet look how easily they want to just rip up that peace treaty, just simply dealing with the Temple Mount. So everything changes on a dime over there in the Middle East.
I, from time to time, get people that come up with the argument that this is all Israel's doing, that they're working towards the greater Israel plan and trying to get a heap of Jordan and Syria and to fulfill Bible prophecy borders for Israel. And so they're saying that basically Israel's behind all of this stuff. But I think that for me, one of the main problems with that argument is that going back to, I think, around the Balfour Declaration, Winston Churchill pretty much poured cold water on a plan that would have originally given Israel a whole lot more of that land. And so if the goal had been a greater Israel, it would have happened then rather than now. That's the way I see it anyway. So I'm not sure if you have any thoughts on that.
Right. Well, I think it's safe to say, geopolitically speaking, right now, not geoprophetically speaking in the future, which I'll give you both, spins on this. I think it's safe to say geopolitically right now, Israel would really like to have peace with them, but not at the cost of their security as a nation. And they don't really feel they've got a peace partner. And I don't think their main goal is to spread their elbows and grab more land. However, they will do that, and they did do that in 1967 for two reasons. And this is not a unique thing in Israel's history. Because when they expand their borders, they increase the defensibility of those borders. And two, they believe, the tradition, especially the Orthodox Jews, believe that land was bequeathed, given to Abraham, their descendant. And indeed it was, of a whole bunch of land. It's called the Promised Land, and that's in Genesis 15:18. And the measurements of that land go from the river of Egypt, the Nile, all the way to the river Euphrates, which courses through modern-day Iraq and Syria. At no time has Israel possessed all that. According to the Bible, at some time it will possess all of that. I believe that will happen when the Messiah returns. I believe the Messiah will have a second coming, Jesus Christ, and he will set up his kingdom, a messianic kingdom for a millennium, 1,000 years. That's in Revelation 20, verse 4. And at that time, whatever land they don't have within that measurement, they will get. However, historically, when they win wars, they take land. This happened with Joshua about 3,300 years ago, and he took more land than Israel even has right now. They went into across the Jordan to the east into what is modern-day Jordan. And then King David and King Solomon around 3,000 years ago did the same thing and even took more land than Joshua had and went up into the Euphrates all the way up through Syria. Of course, in 70 AD, Israel was dispersed into the nations of the world, and then in 135 AD, Israel was renamed, Palestinia or Palestine as we've known it. It never really was a nation per se. Borders always shifted. They were loosely defined depending on whether the Muslims controlled the area or whether the Christians controlled it or whatever. But the point is, in 1967, in the Six-Day War, Israel won and took land. There's precedent for that historically, and also Israel did it. Of course, they've seceded the Sinai back to control between them and Egypt, and then the Gaza they relinquished in 2005. Now it's become, we call it Hamastan, because Hamas has taken over it and shot missiles ever since into Israel. But there are prophecies that do point out in Jeremiah 49, verses 1 through 6, and Zephaniah 2, verses 8 and 9, that Jordan will go down by the hands of Israel and be possessed by Israel. Israel will take possession of its inheritance. It says in Isaiah 19:18 that 5 cities in the land of Egypt will speak the language of Canaan, which is Hebrew. That would, part of Egypt to the northeast of the Nile would probably be part of the Promised Land. Obadiah 1:19 says the Jews will clearly take over southern Jordan, parts of southern Lebanon, the Gaza, the West Bank. These are prophecies. So, and these prophecies seem to be a scenario where Israel wins the war, and I believe that would be Psalm 83, and moves in and spreads its wings. So I'm looking for that to happen. I'm looking for a greater Israel, not because Israel is pushing in that direction, but because that is in the Bible.
So how do the Golan Heights and the Sinai Desert play into all of this? What's the significance of them?
The Golan Heights and the Sinai. Well, the Sinai is not a really big deal. I mean, it's a big deal because it's a huge chunk of land. And there was a part of the agreement that was drafted between Egypt and Israel was to, pretty much to let Egypt, well, I guess they sort of seceded it back, but it was never supposed to be an area where Egypt could stage their military in there and that sort of thing. But Egypt's military has been allowed to get in there lately since the Arab Spring because there's terrorists moving in there, and so Israel's tolerated that. But the Golan's the bigger issue, the Golan Heights, because that's a strategic area where Israel can see up at the top of it, see all of it, what's going on with its neighbors in Syria. It's a military strategic point, and Israel will not secede it, and Syria wants it. And a lot of the Syrian revolution is, encroaching on that borders to the point where certain missiles are indiscriminately coming into the Golan, which in response, Israel immediately strikes back. And so that's something to definitely be watching on. Any one little thing, for instance, the Hezbollah war of 2006, when they shot 4,000 missiles into Israel over a 34-day period in northern Israel and kept a lot of Israelis in the north into bomb shelters for a month. That thing started by the kidnapping and killing of 2 Israeli defense soldiers. Created a major war. Just like we said, 2 police officers get shot in Jerusalem, and they shut down the Temple Mount. Many people want Jordan to rip up their treaty with Israel. We don't know exactly what's going to be the catalyst to cause the firestorm in the Middle East, but it looks like something will happen, and that will be the result, because it's land for peace deals are not going to work. They're not biblically endorsed. We're not supposed to be giving away the promised land. American presidents need to be careful about that. Now France, of course, wants to be involved with their peace accord they want to do in Paris with the Middle East peace. When diplomacy fails, which it will, because land for peace deals are not biblically endorsed, wars break out, and that's what the Bible says will happen.
So what about the countries like the United States of America and Europe? Where do they fit in with all of this, do you think? Because, at the moment, at least America is still a big player in all of this.
First of all, I believe America could be in Bible prophecy, and I do believe that Europe is in Bible prophecy because we believe there'll be a revived Roman Empire. We find this out in the book of Daniel. We believe actually the Antichrist will come out of that in Daniel 9:27. It says he comes out of the people who destroyed the city and the sanctuary. The people who destroyed that was the first Roman Empire in 70 AD. That would be Jerusalem, and the sanctuary would be the second Jewish temple. So it's commonly taught that the Roman Empire will be revived with the primary emphasis on, maybe even the European Union as we see it in its fledgling stages over the last several decades. America, it's controversial. A lot of people put it in various places. I think the only place you could really possibly find America with any specific references could possibly be in Ezekiel 38, verse 13. And in my book called The Now Prophecies, I have a chapter in there called Is America in Ezekiel 38? And I put the argument forward that in that prophecy, we mentioned the invaders, the 9 invaders spearheaded by Russia with Turkey and Iran. We mentioned the victim, which is Israel. They come to invade Israel. The victor, which we didn't mention, is not American soldiers or IDF. It's God. It's God has to stop that formidable offense. It's an earthquake, fire, hailstone, and brimstone. But we have 4 other participants involved besides the invaders, the victim, and the victor. And that would be Sheba, Dedan, the merchants of Tarshish, and their young lions. That's in Ezekiel 38:13. And these seem to be protesters, not involved in the invasion, not involved in protecting Israel, but they seem to be saying, what are you doing, Russia? Or, you Magog invaders, are you coming for spoil and plunder and booty? One of the reasons we understand the motive of the invasion of Russia. of Israel from Russia. And so when we do a study, Sheba and Dedan, that could be Saudi Arabia. Dedan clearly is Saudi Arabia. Sheba could be Yemen. Merchants of Tarshish, this is where it gets tricky, and their young lions or their colonies that come out from them. Some people say it could be Spain. I believe that argument's the weaker of the two. I believe the other argument is it could be the UK, which I believe is the stronger of the two, and I put my arguments forward in the Now Prophecies book. So the UK, the second aspect of the British Empire, the sun never used to set on the British Empire, it says, they colonialized most of the world, right? And the young lions, we would suspect, could be Australia, Canada, but with a primary emphasis on America. So I believe we find America there as the young lions. And the concern is this seems to be a group of protesters. Why is with commercial interest, it says the merchants of Tarshish are concerned. Why are we not defending our commercial interests with Israel, which is very wealthy at the time because Russia's coming after that plunder and booty? And so it should be a problem, a cause for concern among Americans. And you can understand why the UK would, try to fight off Russia and Iran and Turkey. The sun's always setting on the British Empire now, but America is still the number one world power, superpower army. And so there's people speculate something happens to America. It could be the rapture of the church taking out a bunch of Americans. It could be an electromagnetic pulse. It could be the nuclear scenario, things like that, that puts America in a more compromised position where they simply are protesters in that prophecy. So I invite people to read my take on it, but there are different arguments as to whether America's in or not in the Bible. But the real troubling issue for every country it deals with in Zechariah 12. It says that at some point Jerusalem, verse 3, will be a burdensome stone for all peoples. All who would seek to impose a burden upon it will be sorely cut in pieces, even though all the nations are gathered against it. I believe that the international community, we're coming up on a 70-year anniversary in November of the partition plan in 1947, which is when the international community divided up the land of ancient Palestine into a section for the Palestinians and then a section for the Jews. And the Arabs rejected that proposal, the partition plan. And when Israel became a nation, as part of that partition plan in 1948, May 14th, the Arabs went to war with Israel. And when Israel, but in that partition plan, the international community meddled, and they separated out Jerusalem to be under international jurisdiction. And so basically that was a huge issue because Jerusalem, now they're imposing a burden on Jerusalem, which is, I can point out in Zechariah and other places why that belongs to Israel, and it was given to them by God. So the international community gets involved. The war happens. Israel wins the war, and they draw in 1949 these green lines called the Armistice Agreements. And so all of a sudden now they divide Jerusalem for the first time in its history to the east and to the west. Jerusalem has never been divided. It's never supposed to be divided, but the international community meddled. They imposed a burden on it. Concerns in Zechariah 12:3 that I just read. It'll be a burdensome stone. No one can figure out what to do about Jerusalem. Of course not. It's a heavy stone for all the nations. Then in 1967, Israel wins the war and takes over East Jerusalem. So now Israel's claiming, control over that, but the Palestinians want East Jerusalem. They want it to be the capital of a Palestinian state. The Arabs want that too. It boils down to Jerusalem. All the roads are going to lead to Jerusalem. And so Zechariah 12 is a very interesting prophecy. But so, as far as it comes to international community with America at the helm right now, they need to be careful because we're told in Zechariah that Israel is the apple of God's eye. And I believe American presidents need to be careful that they don't poke God in the eye.
It's interesting you mentioned that our whole international movement because I've been feeling that the goal of the United Nations is ultimately to turn Jerusalem into an international city. That appears to me where it's what they're attempting to do.
Right, and it's interesting because, in 1995, American Congress passed the U.S. Jerusalem Embassy Act, which appropriated funds and permitted the move of the U.S. Embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem because it has already become an international city as part of that partition plan. However, God's not allowing it to be an international city, as you can tell from these wars. Israel it got divided. The international community tried to divide it, like I said, in 49, and then Israel took it all over in 1967. But the reason this is being a thorny issue for the presidents, who every 6 months can sign a waiver, Clinton signed every waiver, George W. Bush signed every waiver of this Embassy Act, Barack Obama signed every waiver, but President Trump now, on his campaign trail, said, I'm going to move the embassy to Jerusalem. Well, when you understand this Embassy Act, which was put forth by the 104th Congress, it had Section 2 had 17 findings. And among those findings, it clearly stated that Israel has a presence since 3,000 years ago. That predates any Palestinian claims. It should be the undivided capital of Israel. They make it real clear. So in other words, it's not just a simple move of trying to find a spot for it and is there enough money for it. No, it's much deeper than that. Basically, moving this is an acknowledgement that Israel has sovereign control over an undivided city that dates way back over 3,000 years ago. And that's why it becomes a thorny issue, because, you make that statement, you're pretty much supporting Israel's exclusive claims to Jerusalem. And I believe Trump's going to struggle with that one over his full 4-year term here, if he makes it that long.
Because we end up seeing the Antichrist sitting in a temple in Jerusalem, which to me, again, it makes it look as if they'll try and possibly set up some sort of a world religion temple rather than a Jewish temple as such, an amalgamated religion. But that's a whole other topic. One other thing I was going to ask you, though, is, are there two Gog and Magog wars in the Bible? Is this just one war, or are there actually two separate Gog-Magog wars?
There are two separate ones. One is in Revelation chapter 20 that happens at the end of the millennium. It says that Satan's bound for 1,000 years, and then he gets loosened, and then he goes and musters up another war. And it does talk about Magog, and it gets defeated by Jesus Christ. And so there are two separate wars. There's some people try to make it the same war, but there's some pretty good books out there that refute that. Ron Rhodes has a book called Northern Storm Rising that I recommend people read if they confuse those two wars. But there are distinct differences between those two wars. So to answer your question, there are two. There's not one and the same.
Okay, that's great. Thank you. Have you got any other things that you wanted to bring up that we haven't covered?
Yeah, I would say that, the goal of what we try to do with our ministry, we mentioned this at the beginning of your program, is to let people know that there are Bible prophecies that were written, in ancient times that seem to be stage setting for their fulfillment presently. There's about a third of the Bible, 9,000 to 10,000 verses were devoted toward Bible prophecy. It shows you how important that information is to God, not because he's trying to impress us, but because he's trying to inform us. A couple thousand of those verses remain unfulfilled, scattered throughout various Old and New Testament verses. And it looks like they're about to happen, and when they happen, they'll come in a fairly condensed time frame, the end times per se. They won't be, centuries between each fulfillment of the next prophecy. It does not look to be. One prophecy will happen, and then the vacuum, a bigger one will follow on its heels. And I believe those prophecies are about to happen. There are some, I have a book called The Now Prophecies. These are the ones that could happen at the present time. And we have to look at the ones that you look at the details and you realize that there's no more preconditions. You could wake up tomorrow and these things could find fulfillment. We talked about a couple of them, Jeremiah 49 dealing with Iran. We talked about Isaiah 17 dealing with Damascus. We talked about Psalm 83. There's a few more dealing with Jordan and with Egypt. Even the rapture of the church. I don't know, some of your listeners may be pre-trib raptures, some may be mid-trib, some may be post-trib, some may not even believe in the rapture. But there's a prevalent teaching, I think it's biblically sound, and I teach this, that Jesus Christ could come at any moment to whisk his bride, the church, up in the rapture, and the proof text about that is 1 Thessalonians 4 and 1 Corinthians 15. And so the point is that's also would be a now prophecy, these things that could happen at the present time. So I try to let people know that, certainly watch your mainstream news and watch what these analysts say about the, secular worldview about what's going on in the Middle East and in the world and North Korea and Russia and all these things. But, trust the Word of God. Open your Bibles and see if there's anything said in the prophecies that may be real specific predictively about what the future holds for these places that we're all concerned about. And your listeners are going to find out that there's no shortage of details about pertinent information about these places. And fortunately, Tony, you've allowed me to talk about some of that on your show.
Yes, I'm sure there's a lot more we could have come up with to talk about, like I mentioned, the whole religion thing, even and with a one world religion, which I think is a big push at the moment, and will continue to actually grow as a bigger push. Can you give our listeners your website, the details of where they can find you?
Absolutely. And by the way, speaking about the world religion, the global religion, harlot world religion is another word for it, Mystery Babylon, Revelation 17. My latest book is dealing with that. It's called Apocalypse Road, Revelation for the Final Generation. Well, anyway, all the books we've talked about on the show and all the stuff that they can get, the articles I've written, is at my website, which is prophecydepot.com, prophecydepot.com.
That's great. I didn't realize you'd written a book on the world religion because, I definitely see that as a big push that's happening. We can see, oh gosh, I better not get into it because we could go for hours on that one. But, there is a big move towards that, and perhaps we could cover that another time.
Sure, absolutely. We'll do another show, Tony.
That sounds great. Oh, well, thank you for being on the A Minute to Midnight show today, Bill. It's been a fascinating discussion, and I do hope the listeners will actually go and check out these verses and passages that you've mentioned and then look at them in relation to where we are at today.
Yes, sir. I agree.
So thank you. Yeah, we'd love to have you back again.
Thanks, Tony.
You can find all of our shows at our website, aminutetomidnight.com, and we put them out on YouTube, and we also have them as audio-only downloads on the A Minute to Midnight website and iTunes. You can find them on iTunes as well. We have a Facebook group, an A Minute to Midnight Facebook group if you want to join that. I write, play and record all the music that you find in our shows, and you can find my music links to that on the A Minute to Midnight website. In fact, you can download a collection of 15 A Minute to Midnight tracks for free if you so wish. So I'm just going to now finish off with a brief prayer. Heavenly Father, I thank you for being with us. I thank you for this listening audience hearing this. I pray that you would bless them and keep them and protect them. I pray that if there are any listening that don't know you, that they would have hearts that would hunger to know you and that you would lead them to you. For those of us that do know you, I pray you keep us from deception and help our eyes to be open in the Spirit to what is true and what is deception in these last days. Well, that's about all for this show. We will catch you in the next show. Until then, this is Tony signing off.